Yeah, I think look throughout the course of the spring training camp, we've got a pretty good grasp as to the strengths, the things that he does well. Part of it is, each week tailoring the offense around the opponent we're playing, but also the strength of our own players. That's pretty common week to week with each opponent.
That was Broncos head coach Sean Payton talking about what he has learned from Russell Wilson, the veteran quarterback, through OTAs, training camp, and now leading into the week 1 opener against the Las Vegas Raiders, what he's seen from the quarterback in preparation for that game. Welcome, everybody, to the Not Another Bucking podcast. I'm your host, Nick Kosmider, Broncos reporter at The Athletic. And today we're going to tackle 5 burning questions ahead of Sunday's opener against the Raiders, the team that the Broncos have somehow lost to 6 times in a row. And if you want a stat, here's a crazy one. Since 2020, the Raiders are 24-26. Hardly a picture of a dominant outfit in the AFC. However, they have won 6 of those 24 games against the Broncos. So a quarter of their wins over the last 3 seasons have come against Denver. Last season, the Raiders were 6-11. 2 of those victories came against the Broncos. It's confounding. It's one thing to have lost 15 games in a row to the Chiefs, as the Broncos have, the longest interdivision losing streak in the NFL. The Chiefs have Patrick Mahomes. So as bad as that is, his record against the entire division is dominant. He's the best quarterback in the NFL, and he always seems to have just enough magic to topple the Broncos. But the Raiders streak, given what Las Vegas has been over the last 3 years, really, dysfunctional, right? They've changed head coaches. That Josh McDaniels had a rocky first season. They've got some really great top end talent, right? Josh Jacobs, Max Crosby, who we'll talk about in a minute, and Devontae Adams are 3 of the best 30, 40, 50 players in the NFL. But they have serious roster holes everywhere else. They've dealt with their fair share of dysfunction. And yet here the Broncos are in their longest losing streak to the Raiders since 1994. And that just kind of epitomizes, I think, this stretch that the Broncos have been in. But it also crystallizes the opportunity ahead for Sean Payton. In his very first game as the Broncos head coach, coming off a forgettable 5-12 season, they have hired him at a reported $18 million a year as the guy who is going to help turn this around, finally get the Broncos back on a winning track. And there's no better opportunity to start that mission than to host a Raiders team that is not picked by a lot of people to do much in the AFC, and have that game at home and have a chance to snap, like I said, that 6-game losing streak that goes back to the start of the 2022 season. So to get into that, let's again, 5 questions about the team, about the Broncos heading into this game. Number 1 for me, can the Broncos take Russell Wilson, to use Payton's terms, off the high dive? Can we see that here in week 1? And what does that mean? That's one thing that I'm going to have a story on Thursday in The Athletic that you'll want to check out. But that has sort of been the mission that Sean Payton created from the very first time he stepped foot in Denver back in early February with his introductory press conference. Last year, Russell Wilson was sacked a career-high 55 times. He missed 2 full games and part of a third due to injuries. He did not have a lot of support from a play-calling perspective. His offensive line was porous. Injuries wrecked his personnel on offense. There were times where I think there were 3 different undrafted wide receivers playing for him during a game in Tennessee. Now, Russell Wilson is not absolved of all that went wrong in 2022. That would be disingenuous to say. He had his issues both, on the field and sort of in the way that he went about kind of moving into Denver and kind of having some of the attention that he did with some of the things that he was doing. But this whole idea that he's sort of unsalvageable doesn't square with what he has done in the past. And a lot of that, Sean Payton said even before he got this job with the Broncos, going back to an interview he was doing while working with Fox last year, where he said, if I was coaching Russell Wilson right now, what I would do is I would dig through and put together this compilation of his greatest hits, right? We look at all of his touchdowns. We look at the things that he has done in the red zone and find the things that he does well and really kind of take that album of greatest hits, as he called it, and spread that into our offense. And so for me, part of what that has to look like is, again, a much more complementary ground game than the Broncos had a year ago. I think they have the backfield pieces in place. Javonte Williams, but by all accounts, is healthy and ready for this season after last year's major knee injury. They brought in a guy in Samaje Perine who I think a lot more durable at this point in his career, a lot more trustworthy than was Melvin Gordon, who entered last year as sort of the 1B to Javonte Williams. And then with Jaleel McLaughlin, who we've talked about on the show, the undrafted rookie, you have a guy who they can use in a multitude of ways to pressure some of the pinch points for a defense. The other part of that is the offensive line, right? They invested a combined $82 million guaranteed dollars in Ben Powers, the left guard, and Mike McGlinchey, the right tackle. Garrett Bowles is back after missing most of last season with a broken leg. Quinn Miners is sort of a rising player there at right guard. And, reports about Lloyd Cushenberry's improvement heading into his fourth season have been a part of Denver's camp as well. So that is a part of it, right? The personnel that allows you to do this complementary run piece of the offense that the Broncos didn't have. And because they didn't have that, put Russell Wilson in a lot of situations where defenses were just pinning their ears back, getting after him. And as Russell Wilson's footwork dissolved amid all that pressure, amid all those hits that he took, it just strayed further and further from what the Broncos wanted to do, what constituted a competent offense. The other part of this is schematic. What is Sean Payton going to do from a play calling perspective that will allow Russell Wilson more comfortable throwing opportunities, give him more layups? That was the thing with Denver's offense last year. There was just so few easy plays. There were no layups in that offense. Everything was like you were having to push through mud in order to get where you wanted to go. So that is going to be the big thing for me. Can they take him off the high dive? In other words, when we watch this game on Sunday, will Russell Wilson feel more just like a part of this offense as opposed to a player at 34 years old who is being asked to raise all ships? That brings us to question number 2. What is this playbook going to look like under Sean Payton? So Seth Wickersham of ESPN had a great profile over the weekend of Sean Payton after having spent a lot of time with the head coach this summer, both at his offseason home in Idaho, as well as time spent in the Broncos facility with Payton. And one of the takeaways from that piece, and there were many, was he's talking about his zest as a play caller. And there was an anecdote in there from Wickersham where Payton has been told or asked or pleaded with by assistants at various points during his career in New Orleans who said, hey, don't unwrap all the best plays on this play sheet within the first quarter of this game, right? He has had this like tendency, right, to want to just sort of go for the kill right away. And I'm really curious to see, given that he has sat out an entire season, and he mentioned last week how eager he was to, get into that late night mode, grinding over the film, finding these little things that he can exploit in the opponent, and build that into the game plan. So what is it going to look like? What kind of shots are they going to take? What sort of gadgets do they have in store? Who is going to be, a part of this offense? How much will, for example, Jaleel McLaughlin factor into things? Is Marvin Mims one of 3 active, healthy wide receivers on this team, the rookie, playing in his first regular season game Sunday? What kind of impact is he going to have? What kind of package are they going to have for him? A lot of really interesting questions, I think, that come from just what will this this playbook look like? What will the game plan look like? And it was interesting to hear some of these players talk about their level of excitement for digging in to this playbook for the first time. Here's wide receiver Courtland Sutton, the veteran of this offensive group, talking about his eagerness to dive into Sean Payton's game plan for the Raiders.
This extra data we got, to be able to see, the early, bits of his game plan and what his, idea is, I think it's going to be a lot of fun to go watch it, come to fruition out there, on Sunday.
Okay. Burning question number 3 ahead of Sunday's game against the Raiders. How much will Javonte Williams figure into the plan? We mentioned him a moment ago, the third-year running back suffered a torn ACL and other ligament damage in a game against, yes, the Raiders last October 2nd. So when he lines up against the Raiders on Sunday, it will have been about 49 weeks since that major knee injury, and here he is already back. He got to get in the game against the 49ers, Denver's second preseason game, was targeted earlier in that game. I think it ended up with about 7 or 8 touches in a pretty brief span. They wanted to see kind of right then and there what kind of load he could handle, how quickly he would how quickly he would bounce back from that. And we've talked about it a little bit, right? Joe Lombardi, the offensive coordinator, hinted that Javonte Williams is not going to have his full, probably his full range of his full capacity right away as an offensive player for the Broncos. He is going to need to, I think, build into what they're doing a little bit. But he's going to be a part of it. He will probably start that first series for the Broncos, I would think. Certainly that they could go a different direction. But how much does Javonte Williams get involved? We know we've seen him develop more and more as a pass catcher out of the backfield. They will split him out wide at times in the slot. So he's going to be a guy that they're going to use in multiple ways. But again, for him to be all the way back 49 weeks after suffering that injury against this Raiders team, albeit in Las Vegas, he's back and ready to take on the Raiders. So, that's a big question. And then what does the running back share look like? It wouldn't surprise me if you see Samaje Perine get, 18 carries in this game. I think they're going to really ride him, especially early in this season as they kind of see how well Javonte Williams is progressing, through the contact of these games, through the workload of the regular season. I think you're going to see a lot from Perine in the first 3-4 weeks of the year to all you fantasy owners out there. And then again, like I mentioned a second ago, really curious to see what Jaleel McLaughlin, what he gets out of this offense, how much they use him. Will he return kicks as he did with that 44-yard return against the 49ers? Those are just some things with the running backs that I'm really curious to see, because as we talked about it, that has to be such an important part of this offense, is getting all of those guys in different ways going from the very start. That brings us to question number 4. And this is how the Broncos handle the dynamic duo offense-defense of Max Crosby, the pass rusher, and Josh Jacobs, the NFL's reigning rushing champion. These guys are good every week, right? They're 2 of the best players in the NFL. They look like first ballot Hall of Famers when they play the Broncos. Max Crosby, this is another stat that kind of blew my mind. During this 6-game winning streak against the Broncos, he has 10 sacks. I'll say that again. In this 6-game winning streak for the Raiders against the Broncos, he has 10 sacks. Here's some context. The Broncos have not had a player record 10 sacks in a season since Von Miller and Bradley Chubb both did it in 2018. Again, 10 games Max Crosby has done this. He has had a 3-sack game. Last year, he took down Russell Wilson twice in each of the matchups against the Broncos. He has been an absolute force against Denver. They brought in Mike McGlinchey, right? A guy who has some experience in that NFC West, facing some really talented pass rushers, going against Nick Bosa in his practices every week. But he's a guy, when he faced his last, just stud pass rusher, it was in the playoffs against Micah Parsons, and it was not a pretty picture for Mike McGlinchey. New year, new scheme, and obviously Garrett Bowles, I'm sure, will get a shot at him. One of the things that Crosby does so well is he'll bend inside. So it is really a 5-man effort, and even deeper than that, right? Like the running backs being a part of it. Russell Wilson having to be aware on every single play of where Crosby is. Again, 4 of the 55 sacks he took were from Max Crosby. So that is going to be a really interesting dynamic for the Broncos offense. Can they figure out a way to really try to limit Crosby without giving other guys consistent free runs at the quarterback? That is going to be a big one. And then with Jacobs, here's another guy that during this 6-game winning streak for the Raiders against the Broncos, Josh Jacobs has 739 total yards in those 6 games. He's averaged 109 yards on the ground in those games. He has scored 7 touchdowns in those 6 games. He's a guy that kind of salted both of those games away for the Raiders last year, particularly the Week 4 matchup in Vegas when the Broncos had a chance to get the ball back and go down and take the lead. And instead, Josh Jacobs just, bit by bit worked his way down the field. The Broncos were unable to contain him. Now, Jacobs did not participate in, the majority of training camp. He just came back to the team last week after finally reaching an agreement on a new 1-year deal with the Raiders worth up to $12 million. So he has not had the full ramp up that other players have, but the Broncos in no way think this will limit what the Raiders do with him on Sunday. And in fact, Alex Singleton, the Broncos linebacker, said this just means he's going to be the freshest guy on the field. But we're excited for that challenge. We're eager for it. So whether they can stop those two guys is going to go a long way toward whether the Broncos can end this streak. Obviously, the other star for the Raiders is Davante Adams, who even in a down year for the Raiders offense last year had a 1,500-yard phenomenal season. That matchup that he will have with Pat Surtain, who was an all-pro cornerback last year, arguably the best in the league at his position, that matchup was dynamite last year. Pat Surtain got the better of Davante Adams in the first game, even though the Broncos lost. And it was pretty even in the second game until Davante Adams worked Pat Surtain on a double move to catch the game-winning touchdown pass in overtime, one of the few sort of letdowns we saw from Surtain last year. So that is going to be an awesome matchup to watch. But again, at least the Broncos have a neutralizer, so to speak, for Adams. Like Davante Adams is going to get his yards, but you feel good about who you have over there covering him. With Max Crosby and Josh Jacobs, much more of a team effort. Can they get it done? The last question for us here going into week one, or last question for me is, what does this pass rush look like against Jimmy Garoppolo? This is an aspect of the defense that was a big question mark for us going into the offseason, going into training camp. Number of reasons for that, right? They traded Bradley Chubb last year for the first round pick that they eventually used to acquire Sean Payton's rights from the Saints. They did not replace Bradley Chubb, a former first round pick, in any real meaningful way this offseason, right? They did not draft a pass rusher. They did not sign one in free agency. They signed Frank Clark, I should say, but didn't sign a kind of a surefire starting edge rusher, 45 play, 50 play guy in free agency. So you still sort of have that vacancy. The other question mark, of course, is Randy Gregory, the player to which the Broncos gave a 5-year contract last offseason with $32 million in guaranteed money. He's coming off a debut season in Denver in which he played only 6 games, was beat down by injuries, was a tough transition year for him. First 4 weeks of the season, he looked like an absolute disruptive force when he was in there, but he too got hurt against the Raiders, had a knee injury that required surgery, came back later in the season, but was never able to kind of fully regain where he was before that. And all that came on the heels of a training camp in which he did not participate. He was rehabbing from a shoulder surgery that he had at the end of his last season in Dallas. And so I just think never truly found, the rhythm that he needed to kind of be that dominant guy that the Broncos hoped he would be when they signed him to that big deal. Randy Gregory has been healthy this training camp. He's been an active participant. He played in the preseason, and all indications are that he is in a much better headspace than he was last year, as he was kind of getting used to some new surroundings. He's talked about some of the mental health challenges that it presented, and how he's just really tried to address those in the off season and really on a day-to-day basis. So I think there should be some optimism for Randy Gregory. Now, again, it's a guy who has dealt with significant injury issues early in his career. He dealt with suspensions and has never had more than 6 sacks in a season. He's not a guy that is solely judged by that, right? His pressure rate when he's on the field tends to be among the best in the league. He has ways of just disrupting plays, without sacking the quarterback. But they would like to see, I'm sure, some more raw production, but really just have him be on the field, have him be a guy that defenses, in a lot of the ways of Max Crosby, have to really account for with extra resources on a consistent basis. The other part of this pass rushing question mark is who's next, right? We talked about Frank Clark, who the Broncos signed to a 1-year deal, the 2-time Super Bowl champion with the Chiefs, 2-time Pro Bowler. Again, he's just 30 years old. He I think still has a lot left in the tank, as he showed during the playoffs last year for the Chiefs. I think the big question is, can he can he conjure, that level of play early in the season for the Broncos when they have such a pivotal part of their schedule, right? Like they've got the Raiders at home, they've got the Commanders at home. After a trip to Miami, they go to Chicago, a team that was worse in the NFC last year. They have a chance to make some hay early in this season before that really brutal part of their schedule starts to kick in, with 2 games against the Chiefs in 17 days, sandwiched around a game with the Packers. So how much can Frank Clark provide early on? And then lastly, Jonathan Cooper and Nick Bonito, 2 guys, Cooper going into his 3rd season, and then Nick Bonito going into his 2nd, right? Guys still on their rookie deals. How much can they impact that pass rush as well? They both had really strong training camps. And I think Jonathan Cooper in particular showed a lot of growth. He was healthy for the first time during an during a full offseason program for the first time since he got drafted in the 7th round of the 2021 draft. And I think you see the benefits of that, right? Vance Joseph has said he's been their most consistent day in, day out player on the edge. I think he'll have a chance to start there next to Randy Gregory. And so I predicted him in the season preview column I did to lead the Broncos in sacks. Part of that is again, we talked about it, Randy Gregory. He's got to show that he can stay healthy. Frank Clark, I think is a little bit of a mystery right now. But Jonathan Cooper, again, that consistency, he will have kind of the biggest opportunity that he's had in his career. And I think it wouldn't be a shock to see him get 8.5, 9 sacks this year. So how much can they, get after a guy like Jimmy Garoppolo, who was, healthy by all accounts now, came off of a foot surgery during the offseason. He's been in Josh McDaniels' offense before, of course, but, adapting to new personnel, new team. Can the Broncos sort of put some pressure on him early in this game to sort of change some of the momentum early on? We could go on longer. Like there's so many questions. That's the most awesome part about week 1 is we've been covering this team since Sean Payton came here in early February, writing about the different things that we could potentially see when the season finally draws near. But it all goes out the window. They'll line up on Sunday afternoon at Empower Field at Mile High, and they'll get after it, and we'll learn so much about what this team is capable of, how they're going to operate, offensively, and really just sort of how legitimate do they look in their pursuit for their first playoff appearance since 2015. I can't wait. I hope you guys just excited. We will have another podcast after the game, breaking it down, diving in. So reach out on Twitter, on social media, during the game after with any questions that you want to hear, things that you want to hear in the post game show, and we'll make sure that we get to those. Really looking forward to that. Until then, thank you everybody for subscribing. Please, share the podcast, tell your friends, subscribe, give us a review, let us know what you think. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.